What's up, Packer fans? Happy Tuesday. Welcome into a brand new edition of the Pack a Day podcast here on YouTube. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Have a great show lined up for you today. I know I've been on a little bit of a trade kick, but it's the offseason, and what's more fun to talk about than trades? I talked about Stephon Gilmore on Sunday, Devontae Adams yesterday, and now I'm going to be talking about some potential change of scenery type deals, some player-for-player swaps. And I know transparently that a lot of times these sort of deals don't take place in the NFL, but we know that Brian Gutekunst likes to be involved in these type of conversations. I also think this is going to be an offseason that's really potentially unlike any other. So with Green Bay having some bottom of the end players that have been high, draft picks that haven't exactly turned out, I could see them getting involved in conversations for players around the league who have had similar sort of results, who haven't turned out where they've played. And, maybe this swap of places and change of scenery can unlock maybe both players. That's the ideal scenario, right? And if we're being real, a lot of these times what happens is you swap player for player and both players end up flaming out because, let's just face it, they weren't good enough players to begin with. But every once in a while, you'll get a player who goes to a new situation, new team, different players around them, and they exceed and they, exceed expectations and succeed and excel. And, sometimes there's no real rhyme or reason for it, just other than getting a different opportunity with a different team. So there are definitely some players that Green Bay could be discussing here that could make some sense for these type of deals. So before I get into that, there was one piece of, sort of news or notes or noteworthy information for the Packers from a free agency standpoint. Billy Wynn, the defensive lineman for the Packers this past season, posted on his Instagram, kind of thanking Green Bay for his time here. It certainly seemed like a good buy. Billy Wynn was never expected back this season anyway. Really great story in 2020. If you haven't had a chance to go back and read about it, definitely do so. I think Wes Hodkiewicz on Packers.com had a really good article, if memory serves, but definitely check that out. It was a really great story, but this seemingly comes to an end. My guess is this probably does it for Billy Wynn's career. Just didn't have that much left, but really cool story. Hoping he catches on somewhere, and we'll see what happens, but not expected to be back in Green Bay at this point. All right, so let's go over these 5 hypothetical trades as, that could be interesting as kind of change of scenery type deals. So I want to start by talking about Josh Jackson and a couple deals that could make sense here with Josh Jackson involved. And I know there's a lot of people out there that look at Josh Jackson and say, you know what, I'm just not ready to give up on him yet. He was a second-round pick out of Iowa. I don't think Green Bay's used him in his best situation. And with the, spot that Green Bay's at on their depth chart at corner, I'm just not comfortable with trading Josh Jackson for just about anything. And I think there's a fair argument to be made there with where things are at the depth chart, right? So you've got Jair Alexander, then Shannon Sullivan's a restricted free agent, and $2 million on a right of first refusal might be a little bit steep, which could complicate those contract negotiations. Kadar Hallman has not done anything. KB Anento was injured all last year, also has not done anything. You don't know what you have in Stanford Samuels, Kavarie Russell. It's just the cupboard's fairly bare. Of course, Kevin King's a free agent. It's Jair Alexander and a ton of question marks. And at least at this point, you can make a strong argument that of all those players, Jackson has the most upside. Besides Shannon Sullivan, of course, he's played the most snaps. So I can see that argument to some extent. But it was obviously very, very telling this past year that at the end of the season, when he was healthy, this wasn't just a player who was at the end of the bench. This was a player that was not even active because he could not help out in the defensive backfield. He could not help out on special teams, and there was really no reason to activate him, to the point where Kavarie Russell at the end of the season in the playoffs was activated over Josh Jackson. That is a major tell. And some people have said, well, with Mike Pettin leaving, I don't see that changing the cornerback group and how they play and who's going to be good at that position one iota. So the writing is on the wall here for Josh Jackson. I know, new special teams coordinator Maurice Drayton recently said that J.K. Scott and Hunter Bradley's backs are against the wall. Well, Josh Jackson's back's against the wall, and he's, got probably at least a foot out the door right now if things don't change really quick. And if Green Bay does feel like they could swap a player for a player to get somebody new in the door and give them just something different, it would not shock me if Green Bay went that route. So let's take a look at a couple of these deals that could make sense with Josh Jackson. The first one I actually mentioned in my simulation that I did, about a week ago. And I think This one does make some sense for Nathan Shepard, Nathaniel Shepard, whichever you want to go by. But Nathan Shepard, New York Jets defensive lineman, former third round pick in 2018, 72nd overall, taken 27 spots after Josh Jackson was 6'4", 315, started at 8 games in the past few seasons. He's had 4.5 sacks. And ultimately hasn't lived up to expectations. If you remember Shepard from the draft, Fort Hays State University, I want to say, if memory serves, but basically small school player, dominated against far lesser competition. The hope was that he was going to be able to come in because he absolutely looked the part. Size, speed, strength, he's got all of it. But it certainly hasn't translated yet when he's been going from very small school and in college to the NFL level. And what you're hoping for is, again, maybe moving him next to a Kenny Clark and Zadarius Smith and some of those type of players and putting him in a rotation in Green Bay. Maybe he starts to unlock some of that potential, maybe gain a little bit more confidence. Still a younger player. He wasn't young coming out, so he's not like 24. I think he's 27 if memory serves, but I still think that there's talent there with Nathaniel Shepard. And I think if Green Bay feels like he could be a player that adds depth to their defensive line, remember, we don't know what's going to happen with Tyler Lancaster. We don't know what's going to happen with Dean Lowry. You don't have an abundance of depth. Snacks Harrison is likely gone. I mean, right now it's basically Kenny Clark and Kingsley Keke that you're counting on the defensive line. And then you've got a lot of question marks. And at least bringing in a player with some upside and some talent and somebody that could potentially add some depth to that room, I think it makes some sense to try to swing that type of deal. So that's number one that could make some sense. Another one, and maybe one of my favorite ones that I'm going to be discussing today, is Josh Jackson for Justice Hill. Now, Jackson may not be a perfect scheme fit here for Baltimore, so you could actually make an argument of maybe like a Oren Burks for Justice Hill. And remember, John Harbaugh values special teams a ton, which is why Josh Jackson may not be a fit, which is why Oren Burks may be a fit. He has been one of the Packers' key special teams players, and if Baltimore feels like they could get some value out of him as a 5th or 6th linebacker who still has some upside, former 3rd round pick, and could be a core special teams player for them, that could be something that I could see John Harbaugh doing. If they feel like Josh Jackson was a corner that they liked in the draft, want to see if they can unlock his potential, this is a player that I could see them trading for as well. And either one in exchange for Justice Hill. If you remember, Justice Hill was a 4th round pick a couple seasons back. They had Mark Ingram at the time, and then recently they drafted J.K. Dobbins. They've also got Gus Edwards, who's a restricted free agent, but I expect him to be back in Baltimore. And he's basically kind of just been consistently buried behind the depth chart. And the Ravens, don't need Justice Hill, and probably looking for someone where they could get something in return in their situation for him as well. Especially, every team basically grabs a couple running backs either at end of the draft or an undrafted free agency. I've got to feel like they could probably get one of those type of players late in the draft or undrafted that could come in and be the number 3 running back for them. So if they could find a player that they could get in return that makes some sense, I could easily see Baltimore moving on from Justice Hill. He has had very few carries in Baltimore, so he has very fresh legs. He was a 4.4 guy coming out of college, and I definitely think he could be a little bit of a lightning to A.J. Dillon's thunder. I think he could be a cheap option to keep on the roster as a number 3 back. I think he has some kick return ability. I think he could line up and do a little bit of, jet motion type stuff like Tyler Ervin did. I don't know that he could just line up as like a straight, wide receiver threat. I don't think he has quite that skill, but certainly can be used as a check down screen running back and has some skill as a receiver as well. So especially as a running back. So this is a player that I think makes a ton of sense for Green Bay to call about if, in fact, Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams are not back and they look to rebuild this running back group, especially on a budget. Justice Hill could make a ton of sense. And again, I really like how he would potentially pair with A.J. Dillon. Imagine Dillon just pounding the rock, and all of a sudden you've got this smaller 5'10", 4'4", 40 guy that comes in. He's got some agility as well. He can make some moves. Always liked him coming out. I think he has some potential there to be a fit for Green Bay. My next one is going to break my heart. Tim Boyle for Deadrin Sanat from the Atlanta Falcons. First of all, the Packers would have to get Tim Boyle back on a restricted deal, have him sign that deal, and then make a move after that. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. I think they'd like to get something in return for him, and I think they could. There's a lot of teams that need a backup quarterback. The Atlanta Falcons are certainly one of those. Behind Matt Ryan, they don't really have any depth, and this is a really nice piece for Atlanta where he can actually kind of be a true backup quarterback for them in the time being, but he actually possesses enough upside where he's at least intriguing for them. On the flip side for the Packers, this is kind of the same Nathaniel Shepard type of deal. They get a former third round pick from Atlanta and Deadrin Sanat. He's played 63 snaps combined in the past 2 seasons. He's barely played. When he has played, he's flashed the potential to be a run-stuffing defensive lineman. Really liked him coming out of college. He's 6'1", 305, but he's smaller, compact, he's stout. And I think he could actually be a really nice run-stopping piece on that defensive line. I actually think Green Bay could want a little bit more in return for Tim Boyle, and maybe that's me being biased, but based on this deal and how Sanat's played and only playing 63 snaps the past couple seasons, I actually think that Boyle might be worth a little bit more than that. Maybe that's me wishful thinking, but either way, I think this is a deal that could make sense. Boyle doesn't really have a spot on this team with Jordan Love and Aaron Rodgers, and in return, you get a defensive lineman who could be an early down player and be a nice rotational piece. And again, was just a recent third-round draft pick. Next two are going to be Jay Sternberger trades, and this is another one that I know a lot of people are very passionate about Jay Sternberger and feel like that he still has a lot of upside, which I don't necessarily disagree with the upside piece. I would be very hesitant to give up on Sternberger as well. And everyone obviously knows that tight end is one of those positions that usually takes a few seasons for players to break out. That being said, I have heard some rumblings and some whispers around Green Bay that the team is not very happy with Jay Sternberger, that he hasn't fit in super well. And I haven't heard anything that they're looking to trade him or anything like that. And take this for what it's worth. Maybe it's absolutely nothing, but I have at least a strong enough feel based on what I know that Green Bay could be looking to do something like this. So again, I think there's upside there with Jay Sternberger. It certainly wouldn't shock me if he was still on the team this year. I think they could still kind of go out and see what they have in him. But you also have to remember Josiah DeGuara's coming back. And I know these aren't the same exact type of players, but Dominique Daphne's coming back. If they get Mercedes Lewis back and Bobby Tunyon, those are 4 guys they really, really like. I don't know that there's a ton of snaps out there for Jay Sternberger. And remember, similarly to Josh Jackson, Jay Sternberger was benched at the end of the season, even after he was back healthy, even after he cleared all the injury issues. He got benched for Dominique Daphne. I mean, Dominique Daphne by the end of the year was ahead of the depth chart ahead of Jay Sternberger on the depth chart, I should say. So Jay Sternberger has some work to do, and I could still see there actually being some value in Sternberger across the league. And if they really lost faith in him, this is the time to trade him rather than going through camp and getting closer to cut down time. I think there could be some value out there. So the first deal is with the Cleveland Browns, and they're looking to deal away David Njoku. Tight ends are so incredibly important for the Cleveland Browns. So I'm going to say Jay Sternberger for 2 players that actually opted out last season, Drew Forbes and Andrew Billings. And this is giving up some upside, but getting back a player who can plug and play right now as a true nose tackle in Andrew Billings, a run-stuffing guy. He is absolutely massive, but he also provides some pass rush ability. He's going to be coming off a season where he didn't play. He should have fresh legs. And I think he pairs really well inside on rundowns, especially with a Kenny Clark and some of those guys. So I think this is a nice move for Green Bay where you get somebody who can come in and play now on a cheap deal, that you need to find these type of cheap veteran deals for players who can come in and play. And the nice thing about Billings is he's still young. He's only 26 years old. So I know it feels like he's been around for longer, but only 26 years in age. And then Drew Forbes, who opted out last year as well, was a draft pick a couple seasons ago. Interior offensive lineman, probably a guard. Who had some upside. He was a 5th-round pick, opted out last season. Cleveland's kind of developed some depth in the meantime, and he could be a nice piece that kind of competes with Simon Stepaniak and Jake Hansen and some of those other players for some of those final roster spots. So that's another deal that I could see making some sense. And then finally, Jay Sternberger for J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, the wide receiver from the Eagles. Similar situations. Whiteside has kind of fallen out of favor. Travis Fulgham passed him up. Greg Ward passed him up. Really liked him out of Stanford. I think he runs good routes. He has the ability to be a strong blocker, which we know matters to Green Bay. He's a little bit redundant, I think, with Allen Lazard, but we saw Green Bay take Allen Lazard, who similar type of build and route running and run blocking, and be able to kind of reform him and make him into a really good player. I have no doubt that Green Bay could do a very similar type of thing with J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, and maybe even to a higher extent because Whiteside certainly has much better traits than what Lazard had coming out. So 6'3", 225, former second-round pick, 57th overall, only 24 years old. And remember, with Zach Ertz on the block and not likely to be back in Philadelphia, they need somebody to pair with Dallas Goedert. You probably don't want both those guys on the field maybe at the same time because of Jay Sternberger's inability to block, but there could be some use there, and I think they just need depth at the position. So I think this makes a lot of sense for both teams, and Arcega-Whiteside for Jay Sternberger, definitely something that I could see making sense for both sides. So all right, that is going to do it for me today. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pack a Day podcast. Make sure to join me back tomorrow. I'll try to come up with something other than trades just to maybe switch things up and spice things up a bit. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure to check out today's audio podcast wherever you get your favorite podcasts. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.